Good morning. I hope you're enjoying this unique UBC course on COVID-19 and society. I'd like to thank Professor Lyon for inviting me to talk about COVID-19 and the environment. I've been spending a lot of time on that, as you know. Although this course focuses on COVID-19, the pandemic is not the only crisis the world is facing. Even before the first cases of COVID-19 were reported late last year, we were already grappling with the serious issue of climate change and environmental degradation, and that continues today, as you can see, with the wildfires. In fact, just about the same time that health officials were investigating reports of a mysterious new SARS-like illness in December of 2019, UBC was declaring a climate emergency. In the declaration, we noted that the climate crisis is posing and will continue to pose extensive and disastrous threats to people's lives and livelihoods both locally and globally, contributing to famine, migration, and disease worldwide, including impacts on individual, physical, and mental well-being. I'll discuss what universities can do in the climate crisis later, but first I'd like to go over the scope of the climate crisis and then discuss how, despite being a global issue, climate change adversely affects some groups and regions more than others. After a short discussion break, we'll get to the heart of today's topic, COVID-19 and the environment. Finally, we'll talk about the opportunity that COVID-19 presents for repairing the damage to the environment, and then get into the specifics of how universities and their students can help in this effort. So let's begin. Even as we're dealing with COVID, the world continues to experience extreme climate events. We had a good example of this just a few weeks ago here in BC, when the sun disappeared for a whole week because of wildfires in Oregon, California, and Washington. For a couple of days, Vancouver actually had the worst air quality of any major city in the world. Wildfires are, of course, common events, but their effect and impact have been multiplied by climate change. As Steve Easterbrook, director of the University of Toronto School of Environment, said, "We know there is a very clear link between climate change and wildfires, because hotter, drier conditions allow fires to spread more widely." Professor Easterbrook warns that things will only get worse. In his own words, in a decade or two, we might look back on this summer as a relatively mild one in comparison. But even if we somehow stop burning fossil fuels altogether, things wouldn't improve. As Professor Easterbrook says, when we stop burning fossil fuels altogether, whatever temperature the planet has reached at that point will become the new normal. The smoke from the fires was a visible sign of the current environmental crisis, but not the only one by any means. Here are some of the most recent findings of the United Nations Global Environment Outlook. Since 1880, the global average surface temperature has increased between 0.8 degrees and 1.2 degrees Celsius. 8 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred within the past decade. Air pollution now causes between 6 and 7 million premature deaths every year. It's projected to continue to have significant negative effects on health and still cause between 4.5 million and 7 million premature deaths annually by mid-century. It's staggering. Biodiversity loss from land use change, habitat fragmentation, overexploitation, and illegal wildlife trade invasive species, pollution and climate change is driving a mass extinction of species, including critical ecosystem service providers, such as pollinators. Marine plastic litter, including microplastics, occurs at all levels of the marine ecosystem. It also appears in fisheries and shellfish at alarming levels and frequency. Land degradation is an increasing threat for human well-being and ecosystems, especially for those in rural areas who are most dependent on land for their productivity and livelihoods. Almost a third of land globally, home to 3.2 billion people, has been degraded. About 1.4 million people die annually from preventable diseases, such as diarrhea and intestinal parasites, which are associated with pathogen-polluted drinking water and inadequate sanitation. The harmful impact of inappropriate use of pesticides, heavy metals, plastics, and other substances is of significant concern, as such compounds appear in alarmingly high levels in our food supply. They primarily affect vulnerable members of society, such as infants, who are exposed to elevated levels of chemicals. The United Nations report makes for pretty grim reading. We're all suffering from the effects of environmental degradation, but unfortunately, some are affected more than others. And the ones who are most affected tend to be members of marginalized and disadvantaged communities around the world. And yes, here in British Columbia. For example, hazardous waste from Western nations is often dumped without the knowledge or consent of the local inhabitants in countries such as Ghana and other developing countries. There, the toxins are dispersed in the air or leach into the groundwater. Communities of color in the United States, Indigenous communities here in Canada and in BC, and low-income communities everywhere are also at disproportionate risk from commercial toxic waste. Resource extraction, for example, mining for the rare earth metals that are used in smartphones, causes environmental degradation in Africa, South America, and Asia, to the benefit of consumers in North America and Europe. There's also a gender disparity. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature reports that human trafficking rises in areas where the natural environment is under stress. It's found links between gender-based violence and environmental crimes, such as wildlife poaching and illegal resource extraction. Indigenous peoples and local communities manage more than half of the world's land. Strengthening the land and resource rights of indigenous peoples would help combat climate change and environmental destruction. However, environmental degradation from deforestation and loss of biodiversity, pollution, contamination of rivers and water sources, and extractive industries have all had a cumulative negative impact on indigenous communities. The Amazon basin provides the most obvious example of this, but it occurs here in Canada and all around the world as well. So as you can see, even before the onset of COVID-19, our world was in crisis. Before we continue and discuss the current situation, let's pause and discuss what we've learned thus far.